A piercing cry echoes through the marble hallway of the city's most luxurious penthouse. When he opens the door, the powerful CEO finds a newborn abandoned, wrapped in a cheap blanket and wearing a wristband with a disturbing name. "This can't be true," he whispers, trembling before the impossible. But what he doesn't know yet is that the baby is the result of a night he tried to erase from memory, and the truth is about to explode in his face. In the cold early hours of Tuesday, the silence of Richard Thompson's coverage was brutally broken by a sound that would make any man freeze. A persistent, high-pitched cry cut through the dawn air like a blade. Richard woke up with a start, his heart racing. He looked around the luxurious room, with its silk curtains and imported furniture. The sound came from outside. It was coming from the hallway. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, running his hand through his scruffy grey hair. The crying continued, louder and louder, more desperate. Richard got up from the king bed, stepping onto the cold marble floor. He put on his leather slippers and walked to the door, annoyed. He thought it was some inconvenient neighbor, perhaps a sick child. But when he opened the armored door of his penthouse, the scene he found made him retreat 2 steps. There, right in front of the entrance, there was a wicker basket. And inside that basket, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, was a newborn baby. The child cried hard, his little face red and contracted. Next to the basket, a white envelope. Richard's blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he picked up the paper. With nervous fingers, he opened the envelope and read the words that would change his life forever. "It's your son. I can't take care of him anymore." "No, so it can't be," Richard whispered, looking at the baby again. The crying was deafening now. The multi-millionaire CEO, known for leading meetings with hundreds of people, was there, paralyzed in front of a newborn. His first reaction was not tenderness. It was not protection. It was pure desperation. Richard Thompson, owner of one of the largest technology companies in the country, known for his coldness and arrogance, treated that child as a problem that needed to be solved immediately. "Security," he shouted, pressing the intercom button. "I need you up here now, now!" His voice echoed down the empty hallway. The baby kept crying, but Richard didn't touch him. She didn't bend down to look at him closely. He stood there as if the child were a bomb about to explode. Minutes later, 2 security guards appeared in the hallway, panting for having run up the 15 floors. "Mr. Thompson, what happened?" asked Carlos, the head of security. "Someone left it here." Richard pointed to the basket as if it were garbage. "I want you to find out who did it. I want the images from the cameras of the last 3 days. I want to know who had access to this floor." Carlos looked at the baby, who continued to cry. "Sir, but what do we do with the child?" "That's not my problem," burst out Richard. "It's some scam, some attempt at extortion. Do you think I'm an idiot? That they are going to deceive me with this story?" The baby cried louder and louder. Richard ran his hands over his face, visibly distraught. "Take it from here. Call the guardianship council, the police, I don't know. Just get it out of my door before anyone else sees it." Carlos hesitated. "Sir, it's a newborn child. She needs care. I don't want to know," Richard shouted, his voice echoing down the luxurious hallway. "My only concern is that no journalist finds out about it. No staff, nobody, understand? If this leaks to the press, you are both fired." The other security guard, a younger man named Roberto, looked down on the baby. "Mr. Thompson, maybe you should do your job," Richard cut him off. "Find out who did it and solve this problem before it becomes a scandal." Richard went back inside the penthouse, slamming the door hard. On the other side, Carlos and Roberto stood there, not knowing what to do with that abandoned child. The baby kept crying, as if he knew he had arrived at the wrong place, at the hands of the wrong person. And Richard, on the other side of the door, leaning against the wall of his luxurious living room, felt his heart racing. Not of emotion, but of pure panic. In his head, only one thing was going on. "This is going to ruin my career. This will destroy everything I've built." The man who ran a company with more than 10,000 employees couldn't handle a baby of a few days. And in that moment, Richard Thompson showed exactly who he was. A cold, arrogant, selfish man, unable to see beyond his own reputation. What he didn't know is that this child wasn't a stranger trying to take advantage of him. It was the result of his own actions. Actions that he had chosen to forget, but that now came back to take their toll. But to understand how Richard Thompson got to that moment, We need to go back 3 months in time. 3 months when everything seemed perfect in the arrogant CEO's life. It was a Friday in December when Sophie Martinez first stepped foot in the mirrored Thompson Tech Industries building. At 23, she carried a shabby leather briefcase and a resume that would impress any recruiter. Graduated in business administration with honors, she spoke 3 languages and had experience in 2 smaller multinationals. But Sophie wasn't just there for the job. She was desperate. His mother, Maria Martinez, had been hospitalized for 2 months in a private hospital, battling an aggressive cancer. The health plans had denied coverage for the experimental treatment that could save her. Sophie had sold the car, pawned the family's jewelry, and borrowed at abusive interest. Even so, there were still 80,000 reais to complete the treatment. The intern position at Thompson Tech paid well above the market. It was his last hope. Sophie Martinez called the receptionist a dapper, middle-aged woman. "Mr. Thompson will receive it now." Sophie took a deep breath, adjusted the black blazer she had bought at a sale, and walked down the marble aisle. The walls were decorated with business awards and photos of Richard with politicians and celebrities. Everything there screamed power and money. The office door opened and Sophie saw Richard Thompson for the first time. Tall, perfectly groomed grey hair, suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. He was on the phone, gesticulating authoritatively. "I don't care if the customer is dissatisfied," he said on the phone. "Either he accepts our conditions or looks for another company. Simple as that." He hung up without saying goodbye and looked at Sophie. "So you're the famous Sophie Martinez," he said, without getting up from his chair. "Impressive resume for someone so young. Thank you. Mr. Thompson, I am very much looking forward to contributing to the company." Richard analyzed her from top to bottom, in a way that made Sophie feel uncomfortable. It was not a professional look. It was the look of a predator assessing its prey. "Sit down," he ordered. Sophie obeyed, crossing her legs and keeping her hands on the briefcase. "Tell me about yourself. Why do you want to work here?" Sophie took a deep breath. She decided to be honest. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be direct. My mother is very sick. She needs expensive treatment, and I need a good salary to be able to pay. I know I can contribute a lot to the company, but I'm not going to lie about my motivations." Richard smiled. Not a gentle smile. It was the smile of someone who had found a vulnerability. Honesty. "I like that," he said, leaning back in his chair. "And what is the value of this treatment?" 80,000 reais, sir." A considerable amount. Richard drummed his fingers on the table. "What if I tell you I can help you with this?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "What do you mean, sir?" "Simple. You work directly with me. Not as an intern. As my personal assistant. Salary of 15,000 per month, plus bonuses for performance. In 6 months, you'd have the money you need." It was a salary far above the market for someone who had just graduated. Sophie knew there was something strange, but the image of her mother in the hospital spoke louder. "I accept. Mr. Thompson, thank you very much." "Great, you start on Monday." Richard stood up and held out his hand. When Sophie squeezed it, he held it for a few seconds longer than necessary. "And Sophie, you can call me Richard when we're alone." In the first few weeks, Sophie proved to be exactly what Richard had hoped for. Intelligent, dedicated, efficient. She arrived before him and left after. He organized his schedule, prepared impeccable reports, and treated difficult clients with diplomacy. But Richard had not hired her only for her competence. From day one, he watched her. The way she walked around the office, how she tied her hair when she was concentrated, how she bit her lip when she was nervous. Sophie, in turn, tried to keep the relationship strictly professional. But I noticed the looks, the seemingly innocent comments about his appearance, the times he got too close when reviewing documents. "You're doing an exceptional job," Richard would say, pausing behind her chair as she typed. His hands rested lightly on his shoulders. "Your mother must be very proud." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Sophie replied, trying to subtly pull away. The atmosphere became increasingly tense. Richard began to ask her to stay late, even when there was no urgent work. He suggested business dinners and unnecessary trips. Sophie needed the job. He needed the money. And Richard knew it. The situation reached the limit at the company's end-of-year party. It was a Friday in December. In the ballroom of the most expensive hotel in the city, all the employees were there, dressed in social attire celebrating a year of great profits. Sophie had bought a simple but elegant black dress. She arrived at the party nervous, trying to maintain the balance between being sociable with her colleagues and avoiding embarrassing situations with Richard. But Richard had planned that night carefully. During the party, he drank more than usual. 50-year-old Scotch whiskey, served in crystal glasses. With each dose, his gazes at Sophie became more intense, more brazen. Sophie, he approached her near the bar, already visibly altered by the alcohol. "How you look beautiful tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, the party is very good." "Call me Richard," he placed his hand on her waist. "I want to talk to you." In particular, Sophie felt the alarm go off in her head. "Maybe it's better to talk on Monday in the office." "No," his voice grew firmer. "It's now. Let's go to my office. I need to discuss your year-end bonus." Sophie knew it wasn't about bonuses. But when he tried to walk away, Richard grabbed his arm. "Sophie, you're not going to disappoint me, are you? Not after all I've done for you." The emotional blackmail was clear. Sophie looked around. The party continued, loud music, people laughing and talking. No one paid attention to them. I need to go to the bathroom," he said, trying to buy time. Afterwards, Richard didn't let go of his arm. "First, our conversation." And there, at that moment, Sophie Martinez realized that she had fallen into a trap. Richard Thompson was not just a demanding boss. It was a predator that had identified its vulnerability and was now ready to take advantage of it. What she didn't know was that that night would change her life forever. And that the man who stood before her, smiling arrogantly and smelling of expensive whiskey, in a few months would be standing before her own door, refusing to accept the consequences of her actions. That December night, Richard led Sophie to his office on the 20th floor of the building. The place was empty, only illuminated by the city lights that came in through the panoramic windows. The sound of the party still echoed from below, but it seemed distant, muffled. "Sit down," Richard pointed to the leather couch in his private living room. Sophie preferred to stand near the door. "Richard, I think we'd better get back to the party. People will notice our absence," he laughed. A low, unpleasant sound. "Sophie, you still don't understand how things work here, do you?" He walked to the private bar and poured more whiskey. "Nobody questions what I do. I'm the one who runs this company." Sophie felt her heart race. The situation was getting out of hand. "About your bonus," Richard continued, approaching her. "I've been thinking." "You deserve much more than I initially promised, Mr. Thompson." "Richard," he interrupted her, stopping a few inches from her. The smell of alcohol was strong. "You're a smart woman, Sophie. He knows he can have everything he wants here. Better salary, higher position, even extra help for his mother." Sophie tried to retreat, but her back met the wall. "I just want to do my job right," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "And it does," Richard put one hand on the wall next to his head, "but I could do much more. For me." Sophie closed her eyes, trying to think of a way out. Her mother was in the hospital, depending on her. If he lost that job, he would also lose the only chance to pay for the treatment. "Please," he whispered, "don't do that." But Richard Thompson was a man used to getting everything he wanted. And that night, he wanted Sophie. What happened in that office was swift and brutal. Sophie tried to resist, but Richard was stronger, more powerful. When he finished, he pulled himself together as if nothing had happened. "You're a smart woman, Sophie," he said, adjusting his tie. "So I'm sure he'll know how to deal with it in a mature way." Sophie was huddled on the couch, trying to mend her torn clothes. Tears flowed silently down his face. "I'm going to raise your salary to $20,000 starting in January," Richard continued, as if he were doing a favor. "And I'll advance 2 months for you. Your mother can start treatment next week." He placed an envelope on the table. 40,000 reais. As promised, Sophie looked at the envelope, then at Richard. She was torn between disgust and despair. "I needed that money. His mother was dying." "You can go home," Richard said, turning back from his desk. "And Sophie, that stays between us, doesn't it? It would be a shame if there were misunderstandings." Sophie picked up the envelope with trembling hands and left the office without saying a word. On the way down the elevator, she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman she saw. Scruffy hair, smudged makeup, red eyes. For the next few days, Richard acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted Sophie normally, gave work orders, behaved like the professional boss he pretended to be. But Sophie had changed. She was quieter, more withdrawn. She avoided being alone with him. and always made an excuse to leave the office when he suggested private conversations. "Are you okay, Sophie?" asked Carla, a co-worker, a few weeks later. "You look different." "I'm just tired," Sophie lied. "My mother is getting better, so everything is fine." But everything was not fine. Sophie found out she was pregnant in mid-January. The positive test made her panic. She knew exactly when it had happened. He knew who his father was. For weeks she tried to muster up the courage to tell Richard. He rehearsed the words, imagined what the conversation would be like. Part of her hoped that he would take responsibility, that perhaps it would show a human side that she had not yet seen. One morning in February, Sophie knocked on the door of Richard's office. "Come in," he said, without looking up from the documents. "Richard, I need to talk to you. It's important. If it's about work, leave it on my desk and I'll see it later." "It's not about work," Sophie took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." Richard stopped writing. He looked up slowly and stared at her. "And what does this have to do with me?" Sophie felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. "What do you mean, what does it have to do with you?" "You know very well that in what? Richard stood up, his voice cold and controlled. "Are you hinting at something, Sophie?" "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm saying you're the father of this child." Richard laughed, a cruel, sarcastic laugh. "Are you going crazy? Do you think you can blackmail me with this ridiculous story?" Sophie couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Richard, you know what happened that night. You know that—" "I don't know anything," he interrupted her. "And I suggest you stop this fantasy before it hurts your career, or what's left of it. How can you talk like that?" Richard returned to his chair as if the conversation didn't matter. "Sophie, you're a good employee. It would be a shame if I had to dismiss her for inappropriate behavior." The threat was clear. Sophie felt her legs weaken. "You can't do that." "I can and I will if necessary." Richard picked up the phone. "Marcia, prepare Sophie Martinez's resignation papers. By cutting expenses." Sophie stood there watching her life fall apart. The man who had abused her was now coldly firing her, without even having the decency to own up to what he had done. "You have until the end of the day to clear your desk," Richard said, not looking at her. "Human resources will explain about the termination." Sophie left that office knowing that she had lost everything. Employment, stability, hope, and she carried in her womb the son of a man who pretended not to know her. But what Richard didn't know is that Sophie Martinez wasn't a woman who gave up easily, and that the child he rejected would become the key to his own destruction. The following months were the most difficult of Sophie Martinez's life. Fired and pregnant, she was forced to accept any job she could find. First, she was a waitress at a popular restaurant, later a salesperson in a clothing store. Finally, when her belly was already apparent and no formal job accepted her, she ended up working as a cleaner. Fate wanted her to be hired by a cleaning company that provided services precisely for the Thompson Tech Industries building. Every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sophie cleaned the same aisles where she had previously walked as an executive. She wiped the floor of the same office where she had been abused. He cleaned the table where Richard signed millionaire contracts. For months she worked in silence, invisible like all the cleaning staff. Richard never saw her. He never imagined that the woman who scrubbed the floor of his office was the same one he had coldly fired. Sophie gave birth in a public hospital, alone, on a rainy August morning. The birth was difficult, but when she heard her son's first cry, she knew she would do anything to protect him. "It's a boy," the nurse said, placing the child in Sophie's arms. "What's your name going to be called?" Sophie looked at her small face, her eyes closed, her hair dark. For a moment she saw traces of Richard there, but he also saw Hope Gabriel, she said. "It's going to be called Gabriel Martinez." The first few months with Gabriel were a daily struggle. Sophie worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., slept a few hours, and spent the day taking care of her son. His mother, who had recovered from cancer thanks to the money Richard had paid, helped as best she could. But she was too weak to care for a child. Sophie lost weight, developed deep dark circles. Her hands became rough from so much cleaning product. But he never gave up. It was on a December night, exactly 1 year after the party where it all began, that Sophie made the hardest decision of her life. She was cleaning Richard's office when she found a picture of him in a business magazine. The headline was about his new acquisition, a $15 million apartment in Miami. In the photo, he smiled arrogantly, holding a glass of champagne. Sophie looked at her calloused hands, then at the photo. The anger he had kept for months finally exploded. "I can't do it anymore," she whispered to herself. "I can no longer pretend that nothing happened." That morning, Sophie went to Richard's penthouse. He climbed the service elevators, carrying Gabriel in his arms. The baby slept peacefully, oblivious to the drama that was to come. With trembling hands, she placed the child in the basket she had prepared, along with a simple letter. "It's your son. I can't take care of him anymore." It was not true. Sophie loved Gabriel more than life itself. But I was exhausted, without money, without prospects, and he wanted Richard to face the consequences of his actions. She went down the service elevator and returned home, where she cried for hours, hugging the pillow where Gabriel used to sleep. 3 days later, Richard still hadn't looked for her. The baby was being cared for by the Guardianship Council, and Sophie knew it was only a matter of time before it was put up for adoption. It was then that she decided to confront him directly. It was a Thursday night when Sophie entered the social elevator of the Thompson Tech building. She was wearing a cleaning lady's uniform, but she carried a folder with documents she had kept for months. When the doors opened on the 20th floor, Richard entered the elevator. He was on the phone discussing some important business. For a few seconds, they stood face to face in silence. Richard looked at her without immediately recognizing her. For him, she was just another cleaning employee. "Which floor are you going to?" he asked distractedly, still holding the phone. "For the same as you," Sophie replied, pressing the button on the ground floor. It was then that Richard looked at her for real. His eyes widened when he recognized her. "Sophie," he murmured, hanging up the phone. "Hi, Richard," she said with a calmness she didn't feel. "It's a time since we saw each other, right?" Richard looked at her uniform, at her calloused hands, at her deep, dark circles. "What are you doing here?" "Working," Sophie replied sympathetically. "You remember me, don't you? Sophie Martinez, his former assistant, or rather his former victim." The elevator went down slowly. Richard was visibly uncomfortable. "Sophie, You what?" she interrupted him. "Are you going to pretend you don't know me again? How did you do when I told you I was pregnant?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Sophie laughed, a bitter laugh without humor. "Of course he doesn't know. Men like you never know anything, do they?" She opened the folder and took a picture. It was Gabriel, sleeping in his arms in the hospital. "Do you know him?" Richard looked at the picture and his face turned pale. "That's Gabriel Martinez Thompson, his son Richard. The baby you found on your penthouse door 3 days ago." Richard leaned against the wall of the elevator. It was you who..." "It was me," Sophie confirmed. "And do you know why? Because I've spent the last few months cleaning the floor of your office. Every night I scrubbed the table where you raped me. I cleaned the couch where you raped me. Never have I ever..." "Never what?" Sophie screamed, losing her composure. "Have you never forced me? Have you never blackmailed me? Have you never abused my vulnerability?" The elevator reached the ground floor, but the doors did not open. Sophie had pressed the emergency button. "You're going to listen to everything I have to say," she said, pulling more documents out of her briefcase. "Here are the photos from the December party. You dragging me to your office. Here are the messages you sent me that night, talking about my special bonus." Richard was sweating now. "Sophie, I can explain." And here she pulled out a sealed envelope. "Is the DNA test I did in secret. Gabriel is his son, Richard. And now the whole world will know?" She showed her cell phone, where an email was written to all contacts in the business press. "One click and your career is over," Sophie said, her finger on the screen. "One click and everyone will know that Richard Thompson, the billionaire CEO, raped an employee and abandoned his own son." Richard knelt in the elevator. "Please, Sophie, don't do that. I can make it up to you. Money, any amount you want." "I don't want your dirty money," Sophie said, disgusted. "I want justice. I want you to take responsibility for what you did. What do you want?" Sophie stared at him coldly. "I want you to be a father. I want you to take care of Gabriel as he deserves. And I want you to pay for what you did to me. I'll do anything, anything." Sophie pressed the button for the doors to open. "Let's see if it's true," he said, getting out of the elevator. "Because your life of lies is over today, Richard Thompson." And then she sent the email. The next morning, Richard's cell phone wouldn't stop ringing. First it was the journalists, then the members of the company's board of directors. Finally, the angry customers threatening to cancel millionaire contracts. The story was all over the news portals. Billionaire CEO abandons newborn son on his own doorstep after raping employee. The photos of the party, the compromising messages, the result of the DNA test. Everything had been released. Richard locked himself in his penthouse, watching his reputation being shattered on television. His phone showed 847 missed calls. His secretary had resigned. 3 major clients had already cancelled contracts. But what tormented him most was not the financial crisis. It was the image of Gabriel that kept coming out of his head. The small face, the eyes closed, the desperate cry that he had ignored. In the afternoon of that day, Sophie received an unexpected call. Sophie? It's Richard. She was in her small kitnet preparing a bottle for Gabriel, who had recovered from the Guardianship Council the same morning. What do you want? I want to see my son. Sophie almost dropped the phone. What's it like? I want to meet Gabriel. I want to learn how to be a father. Are you serious? On the other end of the line, Richard looked out the window of his penthouse. Downstairs, reporters crowded at the entrance of the building. I lost everything, Sophie. The company is in crisis. My reputation is destroyed. I can even be arrested. But the only thing that really matters to me now is meeting my son. Sophie was silent for a long moment. Why now, Richard? Why only now? Because only now I understood what I did. Only now have I seen what kind of man I have become. And what kind of man were you? Richard closed his eyes. A monster. A man who abused power, who hurt innocent people, who only thought about himself. But I want to change, Sophie. I want to be the father Gabriel deserves. Sophie looked at Gabriel, who was suckling quietly in her arms. Hey, it's not going to be easy, Richard. I won't pretend to forgive you. I'm not going to pretend to trust you. I know. But give me a chance to prove that I can be different. 3 days later, Richard knocked on the door of Sophie's kitnet. He was different. The expensive suit had been replaced by a simple shirt and jeans. Her hair was unkempt. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. Hi, he said sheepishly as Sophie opened the door. Hi. She let him in. The contrast between Richard's luxurious penthouse and that small apartment was stark. An old sofa, a plastic table, a makeshift crib in the corner of the living room. Is he sleeping? Richard asked, approaching the crib. Yes, he has just breastfed. Richard looked at Gabriel for the first time carefully. The baby had his eyes, his nose. He was undeniably his son. He's beautiful, he whispered, his voice breaking. Yes, Sophie agreed. He was born weighing 3.2 kilos. It was a difficult birth. I was in labor for 18 hours, alone. Richard lowered his head, feeling the weight of guilt. Sophie, I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't change the past. But I want to try to make up for the future. How? Richard took an envelope out of his pocket. That's the contract for an executive position for you. Salary of $50,000 per month, profit sharing, complete health plan for you and Gabriel. You would be a director of special projects. Sophie took the envelope but did not open it. Do you think you can buy my forgiveness? No, Richard said quickly. I know I can't, but I can try to be a decent father. I can try to give Gabriel everything he deserves. And what does he deserve? Love, protection, education, a father present. Sophie looked at him skeptically. Do you know how to change diapers, Richard? No. Do you know how to make a bottle? No. Do you know how to rock a child who won't stop crying at 3 in the morning? No, Richard admitted. But I want to learn. I want to learn everything. At that moment, Gabriel woke up and began to cry. Sophie went to pick up her son from the crib, but Richard stepped forward. Can I? He asked. Sophie hesitated, but eventually agreed. Richard took Gabriel in his arms awkwardly. The baby cried louder. Not like that, Sophie said, adjusting her position. Hold your little head. Like this. Now it sways slightly. Richard followed the instructions. Slowly, Gabriel calmed down. Hi, Gabriel, Richard whispered, tears in his eyes. I'm your father. Can I apologize for not being here from the beginning? Sophie watched the scene in silence. For the first time, I saw Richard show genuine emotion. Sophie, he said without taking his eyes off Gabriel, I know you have no reason to trust me. I know I was a monster with you. But I swear on this boy's life that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to redeem myself. How? First, I'm going to turn myself in to the police. I will take responsibility for what I did to you. If I am convicted, I will serve the sentence." Sophie was surprised. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. You deserve justice. And Gabriel deserves to have a father who did not run away from the consequences of his actions." Richard continued. "Second, I'm going to sell the cover and donate half of the amount to charities that help abused women. The other half will go to Gabriel's education fund." "Richard?" "And third," he interrupted her, "I want you to be my partner in the company. Not my employee, my partner. 50% of the shares for you. Gabriel will grow up knowing that his mother owns one of the largest companies in the country." Sophie couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Why are you doing this?" Richard looked at her for the first time with complete sincerity. "Because you transformed me. Because you showed me the horrible man I had become. And because I want my son to grow up proud of his father." 6 months later, Richard and Sophie's story made headlines again. But this time it was a story of redemption. Richard had kept all his promises. He turned himself in to the police, was tried and sentenced to 2 years in prison in a semi-open regime, performing community service. He sold the Penthouse, donated the money as promised, and transferred 50% of the company to Sophie. Sophie, now as executive CEO of Thompson Martinez Industries, has implemented strict anti-harassment policies and created a support program for female employees who are victims of abuse. Richard left prison every day to work at the company and return home at night. A simple house that he had rented near Sophie's apartment. No longer the luxurious penthouse, but a place where he could be a father. Every night he spent 2 hours with Gabriel. She changed diapers, bottle-fed, told stories. Slowly he was learning to be the father he should have been from the beginning. "Daddy," Gabriel said his first word at 10 months, extending his little arms to Richard. At that moment, Richard cried like he had never cried in his life. Not of sadness, but of gratitude. Gratitude for having a second chance. Gratitude for having a son who loved him despite his mistakes. And gratitude that Sophie had the courage to confront him and force him to change. "Thank you," Richard said to Sophie that night as they put Gabriel to sleep. "For what? For giving me the chance to be a father. For giving me a chance to redeem myself. For saving me from myself." Sophie looked at him with an expression that was no longer one of anger or disgust. It wasn't love, maybe it never was. But it was respect. "You saved yourself, Richard. I just showed you the mirror." And so the story of the arrogant CEO who found an abandoned baby on his doorstep came to an end. But it also began the story of a man who learned that true power doesn't come from money or social standing. It comes from the ability to love, to take responsibility for one's actions, and to transform oneself into a better person. Gabriel would grow up knowing that his father had made terrible mistakes, but that he had the courage to change them. And Sophie, who had been the victim of the arrogance of a powerful man, became an example that justice does not always come from the courts. Sometimes it comes from our own ability to demand that people become better. Comment "Justice Restored," so I know you've made it to the end of this story of transformation and redemption. And just like the story of Richard, Sophie, and Gabriel, I have another exciting narrative waiting for you. Just click on the video that is now appearing on your screen. A big kiss and I'll wait for you there.